Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. If by some chance you've avoided the movies for the past 5 to 10 years, you may not know who Zack Snyder is. And just to give you a brief thumbnail overview, he's a director who has primarily worked with DC Comics, but also worked with Netflix on some original projects. And he's known for his very grim, desaturated takes on the genres of films he enjoys. Which is, I suppose, fine, if that's your thing, if you enjoy watching that. The only film of his that I've seen is Man of Steel, which I found to be kind of a dull take on the character of Superman by a person who either did not understand or did not really care for the character of Superman. But I'm really not here to deconstruct Snyder's approach to making movies. I've only seen one of them, and it was enough to convince me I really wasn't interested in investing time in any more. However, I am interested in some comments he's made fairly recently. The second half of Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon franchise film, I'm not sure what to call it, series that he's been producing for Netflix just came out, and he's been doing press tours for it. And recently, he made the comment in an interview that people who are saying Scott Snyder sucks are in favor of more focused group movies as opposed to more creators' vision. I'll include a link to the full interview so you can see it and all the context around it. But I'm really not that interested in deconstructing the claim itself. It is, on the face of it, patently absurd. I can see a film made with the creator's vision fully intact, realize it's a terrible film, and still be in favor of films with the creator's vision, as opposed to films that are focus grouped to an inch of their life. I think that's obvious to anyone who pauses for even 5 seconds and thinks about it with a level head. The real problem seems to be that Scott Snyder has a very, very small but dedicated fan base who is convinced this is the gospel truth. And that's not surprising. That's really the way a dedicated fan base tends to work, unfortunately. No, what I wanted to talk about is the mindset that produced this statement, which is pretty common amongst all stripes of creative people, and that is the tendency to turn every situation into conflict. Now, that may sound really surprising. There is kind of a stereotype of creative people that they are non-confrontational, or perhaps just out of touch with their surroundings. That's sometimes the case, but in general, a creative person suffers from a terminal case of ego. It is that ego that gives them the foundation to put their own creative vision in place and insist on it, and then insist that other people pay attention to it. So, while I do mean that as something of a negative statement, bear in mind that you kind of have to have that personality trait to really hack it in any creative field. The problem is that ego then creates a huge blind spot. I think most people appreciate that. Most people realize that egomaniacs or narcissists tend to make everything about themselves, even if they don't technically meet the clinical definition of either of those terms. However, creative types, and especially those who specialize in story, bring another layer of difficulty to this pitfall. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. So, now that we're 4 minutes into the video, let's get into it. What is it about the creative mindset that makes them uniquely vulnerable to this kind of trap? Well, simply put, it's the fact that we're used to having control over all of the variables. You see, when you're creating something, be it a work of art, or a story, or a piece of music, you can control what goes in and what comes out. If you're painting, you can use exactly the paints you want, you can mix them in any ratios you want, you can compose the image in any way you want. When you're writing a story, you decide what characters are and are not present. In music, you choose the tempo, the instruments, the key, and any number of other factors. Then you arrange those things in order to get the outcome you desire, or at least as close to it as you can given your skill and understanding of the medium. Many creative people try to apply this skill set to every area of their life, and that just doesn't work. And that may seem obvious, and even if you were to describe it that way to many creative people, they would agree that sounds preposterous. But when you spend all your time developing these habits of problem solving, of setting up situations, of working out difficulties, you tend to default on them in any circumstance. You really have to either set firm boundaries around that kind of behavior or unlearn that behavior in situations where it's inappropriate. A very successful creative person may never have learned either of those solutions. Or perhaps they developed those skill sets at one time, but now that they are successful, they've atrophied because they no longer need them. And as I said before, those of us who work in narrative fields are particularly vulnerable to this kind of trap because setting up a good narrative usually involves introducing a conflict of some type. It doesn't have to be a conflict between one group of people and another. You can have a conflict between a person and nature as they try to survive at sea or survive in the mountains. You can have a conflict between man and his fate as he tries to deal with a prophecy or something like that. But those kind of conflicts are pretty rare in the modern era, and the modern creative has less call to introduce those kinds of conflicts into the narratives they're telling or into the way they look at their life. So we tend to see a lot of this kind of us versus them, me versus the audience, me versus the critics, whatever you have going, in people who spend a lot of time doing this kind of narrative creative work. Scott Snyder is not alone in this. There are plenty of creators in the indie space, as well as in the mainstream entertainment space, who have the exact same mindset. Now, I think that's deeply unhealthy, both to the media space and to the people who have that mindset, but like I said, we're particularly vulnerable to it. Well, now that we're almost 7 minutes into this video, I guess it's time to really get at the point I wanted to make, which is how we can avoid it. And I think we do have to be active in avoiding it. This is not the kind of thing where you can just think, hey, maybe I should avoid this mindset. And then when you get put on the spot, maybe by a tough question in an interview, or maybe just because you read a really upsetting tweet criticizing you on the tweeters, well, at that point, I think it's going to be a bit too late. If you don't have something prepped and ready to go, you're far, far more likely to fall into the worst impulses of your nature than you are to resist them. Do that a couple of times, and it's a habit, and habits are very difficult to break. Unfortunately, that goes double for the unhealthy ones. And again, I think this one is particularly unhealthy. So I think the best thing to do is define the entirety of your creative work by a different conflict right away, so that when these bumps and difficulties come along, you already have a paradigm from which to address them from. For my part, I try and approach storytelling with the mindset that I am battling to be clear and charitable. When I was younger, I tended to be one of those kids who used really big words because they made me feel kind of special, and not everyone understood what I was saying. But as I've tried to tell stories, it's become clearer and clearer to me that that is actually an impediment to the art form. Most people are going to be taken out of a story if you're constantly throwing vocabulary at them. By the same token, I can be very harsh with people, or certainly in the past I was very capable of that, and it is something I have struggled with, both in my personal life and in my creative work. So I tend to look at failures of my creative work as failures of clarity or failures of charity. And if I can't clearly define a conflict through those lenses, at least I have a starting place to find what the actual problem is in my creative work, beyond simply, I am struggling with this guy who has criticized me, or I am struggling with an industry dominated by a technique or a genre. I can exist very comfortably in a world where most of entertainment is quite formulaic and ruled by committee, because my struggle is for clarity and charity. And I believe if I can achieve those two things, I am more than capable of standing on equal footing with all of the pre-processed, committee-approved entertainment that the mainstream puts out. By the same token, when I see people complaining about quote-unquote interlopers like Matt Walsh or Eric July putting out books and doing quite well with them, I remind myself that I'm not in conflict with Eric July or Matt Walsh. I'm in conflict with my lack of charity, with my lack of clarity. If I can overcome those struggles, I'm sure I can do just as well as Matt Walsh or Eric July. By clearly defining and telling myself of the conflicts that I am in, the ones that are most important to me as a creator, long before these points of tension come up, I can very easily resolve them in a way that is much healthier for me and keeps my focus on my art and on my audience, as opposed to constantly wasting a ton of energy talking about people or circumstances that are really irrelevant to me as a creator. It's a major part of why I approach telling stories and making videos here on YouTube in the way that I do. And I think if more people were to think this way as they approach their creative endeavors, they would be able to have a healthier relationship with both their work and their audience. Then again, it's entirely possible that my approach will not scale up well, and I will have to find new ways of coping as my audience gets bigger, assuming it ever does. But for now, at least, I find it to be a very useful mindset to keep as I approach my work. So let me know what you think of it down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.